In this episode of the Will and Alex podcast, we talk to
Shuge Zhang, who is a chartered psychologist, researcher, lecturer, and he's on the editorial board of the Sport and Exercise Psychology Journal. And he went to Bangor University for his PhD and Masters.
His latest research kind of focuses around compassion-focused therapy in terms of decreasing risk for doping and also measuring narcissism and self-compassion within athletes.
He's also looking at theoretical perspectives of these individual differences and how narcissism and compassion can play roles in high-performance psychology, as well as high-performance athletic perspectives and sport-related issues.
The general kind of overview of this chat is crossing loads of different boundaries within psychology. We go into clinical psychology, health psychology, positive psychology. You name it, it's kind of covered in this amazing conversation. What else should we talk about, Will?
Yeah, he was fantastic, and his theoretical insight was really eye-opening, and we were sort of in awe of what he was saying and how contemporary it all was with stuff like muscle dysmorphia, which was really interesting, because that's not even in the DSM at the moment, and so that's still not in classification. And so touching on these clinical aspects was interesting, especially from when his audience was more applicable to general populations, and he was sort of bringing this high-level psychology and sort of this high-performance aspect that only the top of the top, the cream of the crop, can get access to, and was trying to bring it to a more lay audience so that everyone could have this ability to be able to do high performance. Talking about the benefits of narcissism as well, and not just, and sort of it being this buzz term, and that narcissism itself isn't really bad, but can be maladaptive, but also can be beneficial, and that it's sort of warranted within sport and high performance settings.
Overall, it was a really, really insightful conversation. I really enjoyed it, and so did Will, and we hope that you do too. But sit back, relax, and enjoy. Thank you. Well, I guess kind of where we want to start is to know you a little bit better. So
yeah, like a bit of a background, how it all began, and you've mentioned that you were in finance, weren't you, initially?
Oh, yeah.
And then just flipped.
Yeah.
So
That's a really, really long story. So I'm from Chinese mainland. Then I went to Hong Kong, which is obviously the special administration area regions of China, then doing my undergrads. And after spending 4 years in Hong Kong, I decided to find a job and make a live there. And the first industry I entered is finance industry. That was a nice job and good pay. But I feel like I lost something, like kind of sense of self-fulfillment or whatever, kind of satisfaction, like mental energies or feels, so things like that. And things changed or started to change until I attended a very interesting seminar on how psychology and psychologists has been working with Chinese Olympic athletes to cope with pressure. And but ironically, the purposes of the seminar was to help us to train some leadership mindsets and to boost our sales in finance, if that makes sense.
But it just converted you.
But that just opens up a can of whatever things, and and make me think, wow, that's really cool, and why I can't explore that potential avenues and to look into more psychology side of thing. So then I decided to quit my job and started looking around the programs and find out a master program to start in psychology to start with, and then I came to UK and so I basically finished my master programs. At the time I thought, wow, so I got some finance counseling experiences with decent knowledge from a master's. I can probably do my practitioner work or whatever after that. However, after a year of training at master level, I feel, wow, it's about serious science and things, and I need to be serious if I want to go along down this direction. And I started to rethink again whether I should explore different ways, such as focusing on some research work of my interest, which people seems to haven't started to have a lot of work on it, but I'm really curious on it. So then I decided to go into my PhD, and throughout my PhD, I gradually gained more drives and passions in research, which leads me to my current academic position.
Yeah.
So you see the transitions. I try to focus a little bit more on my the earlier part. So you see what the transition. I think the funny story is, I didn't have a psychology background, but I decided to, and after graduation and during my first job. Yeah, in a totally different world.
Yeah, so different. Yeah, I can imagine. But if both, I guess, have the similar intensities. I imagine finance is pretty full on, and I guess psychology can be too. I mean, in research, there's so much avenue you can go down. You've kind of gone into sport a lot with it. And is that what you originally went to your master's in?
That's my original went in. Yeah, so I guess the thing is. That's another story. I try to condense it and tell people, and from people without any genuine psychology background. To me, probably 15 years ago, or before I was 23, 24, 25, starting that a proper psychology training. I think psychology is about clinical thing. Psychology is about Freud. But now I learned Freud didn't even see himself as a psychologist, and there were just so much misunderstandings. In my mind, psychology is about probably psychotherapist. It's about problems, mental illness, and that's psychology to me. But until I attended that seminar. Led by the head psychologist in the Chinese Olympic teams, and started to learn the different psychological skills. We've started to apply it to train Olympic athletes to cope with pressure, and now I learned that psychology has really positive impact. And then a question coming up to my mind is that why we can't apply and transform those things to a wider audience. And with that question in mind, I started to look into sports psychology programs and training specifically, because at the time in my research, I can see education psychology, it seems like all about ADHD, autism, it's very illness focused. And the clinical psychology, it's clinical. And there were other areas of psychology which I don't understand, neuroscience, cognitive things. But when I look in sports psychology, I think, wow, this is fantastic. This is really positive and applicable. And it's all about facilitating people to fulfill the potential, especially when you see the use of different psychological skills. And that's why I started my psychology journey from a sports perspective.
Yeah.
I think you're spot on there. Everything that you've mentioned really resonates with me about how practical application and that the clinical side is too clinical. And the fact that within sports psychology, you're sort of looking at improving performance for people who necessarily don't have mental illness but want to improve in their specialty or something, and you're looking at sort of high performance psychology. And I know the man who he jumped from space.
Oh yeah.
The guy that skydived. He had a high performance psychologist to talk him into the zone basically. And Eddie Hall, the world's strongest man. He pulled, a 500 kilo deadlift or something, and he had a psychologist as well. And it just shows how apparent they are in sport and how much they needed. And Eddie Hall mentioned that he really needed it, and to get into this zone and help him sort of get into a meditative state while he was doing it, and that he really needed to tune in with himself and able to pull such a massive weight. And I think it just resonates with me what you said. I think it's so interesting.
When I was first looking into psychology, I wanted to be a sports psychologist. That's why I do a joint honours with sport. And then I kind of was talking to people that are practical sports psychologists within, like, not necessarily Olympic level, a bit lower, and they were saying how they're only really taken seriously at the Olympic level, at that skydiving from space and Eddie Hall, crazy people that are at the top level, whereas lower down it's not really trickled down the practice. The research doesn't really apply to them at the lower levels really too much, and that's why I kind of didn't go into it. But it is so interesting, and there's so much more to learn in that specific genre of sport. But you kind of specialise within, like, compassion, or your newer stuff at least,
Yeah.
more specifically within, like, compassion, doping, and narcissism. Why did you kind of specialise in those areas?
Oh yeah, that's a really good question, and that comes with my developmental path in psychology training. So I just mentioned, I gained interest with sports psychology by knowing those psychological skills or mental skill trainings applied to athletes. So I started my training, and throughout this journey, I found out really significant individual differences in use of mental skills. So, for examples, we find people high and low in actual versions have benefited differently from goal settings or different use of goal settings. And we started to learn narcissistic peoples or individuals high in narcissism or low in narcissism, they benefited from different type of use of mental imageries. So when I say that, for example, just a really brief example, if you think about your doing some imagery practices and just trying to simulating some images in your mind, for example, like simulating yourself performing some tasks, then someone might seeing that mental simulation from a third-person perspective, which we call it external imagery.
Mm-hmm.
Some people might prefer to or tend to simulate that imagery from a first-person perspective. We call it internal imagery. And interestingly, we find different people with benefit differently from these, at least the two distinguished types of imagery use. For example, narcissistic people or individuals high in narcissism tends to benefit more from external imagery because it makes them feel that they were in the center of the attention, and which satisfied their self-enhancement needs. That's another story, obviously. But throughout the journey, I started to learn, oh, wow, there were so many different psychological skills, but they can be good, they can be not so good, and which the effectiveness of these psychological skills to some extent depends on individual needs and individual differences. So I started looking into it, and obviously I'm probably from quite a competitive background in finance, and I see many of the issues nowadays. At least at that time, I think many of the youth problems issues is probably trying to balancing around competitiveness, but also feeling good, feeling well, but also a good mental well-being, which can at times be labeled as relaxing, lying down, but also feeling good. And so I want to find a way to help people to reach to the competitive level, performing well, but also feeling good, not suffer so much from pressure as well. So I look into pressure, performance under pressure, looking into individual differences. And when I look into individual differences, there's another thing that attracts my eyes, which is narcissism. So basically, it's a rising self-concepts. And everyone would have some sort of narcissistic traits. It's just that someone have more, someone has less. And so by doing these type of narcissism research, we realized the narcissism as a personality trait rather than mental illness have its own advantages in sports, but also have its problems. And I see narcissism, these kind of thing, one typical self-concepts everyone would more or less have some of it. And but moving from there, we find narcissism has its own potential. They are super good at coping with pressure because they see any pressure or difficult situations as the context or the opportunities for them to earn personal glory, because they will see, well, other people are panicking, I'm not, I can do it.
Yeah.
If I can make it, I would be the center of the attention and the glory. So individuals high in narcissism has these advantages. However, the narcissistic traits also have like its dark sides, which has been documented in lots of literatures, and people might name it a lot in their daily life. They might be not so nice. They might be quite controlling in their daily interpersonal life, and in sports settings they are probably not so good at training because they feel training is boring. Training is not competition. So we want to find some way to fulfill people's potential from a narcissistic perspective, but also to mitigate probably the negative side of narcissism. Then we looked into self-compassion, because when you look into Neff's original conceptualization of self-compassion, it is a more healthier approach to gain psychological well-being or psychological satisfaction. So when I say that, thinking about narcissistic persons or people, they would reach psychological satisfaction probably by seeing themselves as being exceptional. So their way to gain psychological satisfaction is to build positive self. Okay. However, that can be at times challenged, and which leads to problems. But looking from a self-compassion perspective, people could potentially reach that level of or similar levels of psychological satisfaction or well-being by accepting and seeing oneself as part of the world, and accepting any failures or difficulty, negative things or negative feedback as a common life experience in certain contexts, for example. So that could potentially allow narcissists to see themselves to especially under difficulties when they were challenged. So offering them a more healthier way to cope, to react, and so hopefully can alleviate their maladaptiveness, the maladaptiveness of narcissistic traits in life, but hopefully help them to fulfill and again to gain their advantages. That's why I started to combine these two research lines together, so narcissism and self-compassion. And one of the first evidence we find is that self-compassion and being less fearful of self-compassion can help narcissistic athletes to be more resistant to doping. So, which might be another story, but I guess that's why you see I'm linking narcissism and self-compassion and trying to make these two together, because I see these two concepts as two competing self-concepts which could coexist in oneself, but we need to find a way probably to better cultivate a good balance between these two in order to gain performance advantages, but also psychological well-being as well.
That's fantastic. What I wondered is how confidence differs to narcissism. So you mentioned you've done lots of stuff in narcissism and sort of beneficial or positive narcissism. And how does that differ from confidence, let's say?
Slightly different. That's a really good question again. And I think people need to think about the different concepts first. For example, if we talk about confidence, and from a serious psychology point of view, we can see confidence as a more trait-like thing, but also could be a more state-like thing. So there are people who are genuinely feeling confident. There were specific moments someone would be particularly confident in. For example, I'm so skillful at podcasting. Well, I'm not. But if I were, I would be feeling particularly confident when I'm doing podcasting. But I'm not necessarily feeling confident when I'm cooking, for example. And so that distinguishes confidence into more trait-like thing and more state-like thing. When we look into narcissism, at least from what the best of our knowledge, it's more trait-like thing. it's not state-like.
Right.
So when we talk about narcissism, people might think about narcissistic disorder, which is not something I would be interested in. I'm more interested in looking into narcissism as a normal personality. And when I say personality, it's a trait. And confidence is certainly some elements in narcissism, but if I'm going to rephrase it, it is not necessarily confidence, but probably overconfidence that has been captured by narcissism. But narcissism also captures some other domains and other aspects of things such as self-centeredness and other concepts as well. So narcissism is linked to confidence, but it's slightly different thing. Yeah.
I was kind of wondering, on like a sports-wide thing, obviously it's going to vary between different sports, and I imagine within team sports it's less narcissistic and individuals it's more, but is there like, what percentage of athletes would you say is being termed as narcissistic? No idea.
That's a really difficult question.
Yeah.
That's a really difficult question. And I don't believe there is any trustworthy statistics around that.
Right.
However, that could be our next research project if we wanted to. Yeah. However, from an evolutionary perspective, I would say there might be a more significant levels of narcissistic characters in individual sports rather than in team sports, because the nature of individual sports allows narcissistic individuals to stand out, and it's like individualism kind of thing. And team sports, by its collective nature, we probably see a less proportion or less prevalence of narcissistic characteristics in team sports, but that's just from a probably evolutionary perspective. However, you could also argue the counterparts, which is team sports offers even better place for narcissistic character to stand out, so a better ground for cultivating narcissistic traits. And so there's obviously two competing hypotheses, and I think that would be a really interesting research direction.
It would be really cool, because I remember like at school, like the popular kids that wanted lots of attention did team sports where everyone would recognise them as, oh, I'm the best football player.
Because they'd stand out more against the crowd sort of thing. Yeah. And
I was more introverted, and so I wasn't particularly bothered about football, but I loved the individual sport where I got more dopamine hits from doing an individual sport because I didn't really care about other people's gratification of my ability. And that would be really interesting, yeah. How would you... Have you got a question? Before
no, go for it.
You did a paper on resilience levels. And I was really interested in like how within like narcissism and compassion, does it link at all within resilience levels?
Not necessarily linked together.
Okay.
And not necessarily linked together. That's probably another story. But I just want to quickly respond to your kind of quotes on the school level experience, and I totally agreed. And there's one thing you mentioned which is centered to narcissistic character, which is standing out. And if we're going to use an academic or scientific term, we call it self-enhancement.
Okay.
Yeah, so if you see self-enhancement is pretty equivalent to standing out in a lay language, and that is centered to narcissistic character or narcissistic personality traits. And one thing I feel would be important for people to know, that is, when we think about narcissism or narcissistic personality traits, we probably think about people like Donald Trump and or similar type of character. That is okay. However, there were another significant proportion of narcissistic individuals who looks like introverted and who could be really vulnerable, who's not so sociable, and you probably see them as a really quiet person. And it is related to what we call the vulnerable narcissism. And they hold the similar levels of self-centeredness and willingness to self-enhancement, but they appear not liking a common narcissistic person people would see. So it's distinguished into what we call the grandiose narcissism. So if we think about grandiose narcissism, they are so outgoing. You can see them. They are so different characters people. But when you look into some people who's really quiet, which doesn't mean that they don't have any narcissistic traits, and it is possible that they are just the low in grandiose side of narcissism, but really high in vulnerable side of narcissism. They could be really neurotic even, and so slightly different. And so with that said, I think understanding the preference of narcissistic people in different settings is interesting. However, more interestingly to me, and probably to practitioners, educators, is to find out how we can make narcissistic traits a better thing. Because when people talk about narcissism, and it's probably my stereotyping, but I feel people tend to see it as a negative label. And I'm hoping through my work and throughout my future works as well, and my efforts are trying to promote the more normalized vision into narcissism. Narcissism is just a normal personality trait. It's like actual versions. So someone is more outgoing, someone is not. Someone is more confident, someone is not. Narcissism is a similar thing, and someone is more narcissistic, someone is less narcissistic. So narcissism.
You're not a psychopath for being
It's not psychopath, yeah, because we all have the different ingredients, but just probably me have more, you have less, but we are just different combinations of a similar list of ingredients, and that doesn't mean narcissism is not good. However, it's probably about how narcissistic traits displays in persons and influences individuals' behavior that matters. So we want to focus on behavioral side of thing, and we want to fulfill the bright side of certain traits, but we also want to mitigate the dark side of certain traits, and that applies to narcissism and applies to all the other individual differences or traits as well. So, for example, you can see extroversion as a really positive trait in social settings. However, extroversion is not so necessarily a good trait when involving in some quiet, independent works. So neurotic can be something sort of negative thing. However, that could be also good, especially when linking to some cautious work. And agreeableness, people tend to see it as a really positive trait. However, within a whole team of agreeableness would probably doesn't work. It won't make any effective group work. So there were always positive and a negative side of a thing, and it's more about how we realize and how we promote the positive and then to mitigate the negative things. And that's my comment for narcissism. Yeah,
that's a great comment.
That's wonderful. I was interested in whether perfectionism played as like a mediator potentially, or whether you've considered perfectionism at all and how that plays with narcissism, and whether also the introduction of compassion can reduce that perfectionism as well.
That's a very interesting topic again, and as I can see, there's a line we're actually moving and developing from these passes. Yes, perfectionism is very relevant. However, I wouldn't say perfectionism is linked to narcissism in a strong matter or way. I would tend to see them as a parallel thing. The reason I say it is from a personality perspective. From a personality perspective, we see perfectionism again a personality trait similar to narcissism. So they are both what we call higher order personality traits. Okay, so when I say higher order personality traits, is probably that specific form or display of personality. So it's not the kind of fundamental personalities such as Big Five, and so when we look into perfectionism or narcissism, you may see different connections or what we call nomological networks with the different other traits. So we call it higher traits because it has a more specific display. And I'm not an expertise in perfectionism. I'm very interested in it. I know there were emerging studies looking into a self-compassion way to mitigate perfectionism, because people tend to see perfectionism as something bad. But I guess my position is similar to narcissism. There were some good things in perfectionism, and
levels,
it's more about cultivating the good thing, but then mitigating the negative thing. And self-compassion, or as a positive self-concepts, definitely could help cultivating the good thing in perfectionism, helping people to maintain their personal standards, but also be more accepting when they failed to do so, and allow them to recuperate and recover into routine works, and to fulfill their personal perfectionistic standards. And that's actually how we define self-compassion in performance and sports settings, which is the center of self-compassion or compassion in sports performance settings. We think, and we try to promote that it's about one's opening, accepting mindset to see sufferings, difficulties, failures as part of the common sporting competitive experience, and allowing oneself, having the ability to allow oneself slow down and to recuperate gradually and re-engage in routine trainings and performance. So and if I define self-compassion in performance settings like this, you may link that a little bit to resilience, like some bouncing back features in it. And so hopefully I started to answer some of the Alex questions relating to resilience. But again, perfectionism is very relevant to self-compassion. It's probably more relevant to self-compassion rather than to narcissism. Right. But individuals can be high in professionalism, low in narcissism, or high in narcissism, low in professionalism, or low in both, or high in both. That's possible because they are both personality traits, if we take a trait perspective rather than looking to clinical sessions. Mm-hmm. I guess our conversations today are in normal population, subclinical sessions. We are not talking about any clinical settings as well. Yeah.
So you mentioned a little bit about those vulnerable and I've forgotten what the one where it's grandiose. Yeah, that's the one. And I remember reading one of your studies. I'm changing direction a little bit.
Yeah.
But you were talking about how that relates to doping. I wondered if you'd explain a little bit further on that in your research within that.
Within a doping context.
Yeah, that's fine. No problem. I try to recap that study, but the fundamental hypothesis is we feel narcissistic individuals, or when I say narcissistic individuals, I'm not trying to labeling people into narcissistic and non-narcissistic. I'm actually means individuals with higher levels of narcissistic personality traits. So our fundamental hypothesis is narcissistic individuals are more likely to dope, because they are so desperate for self-enhancement, they are so desperate for personal glory. And in sports settings, it means that people wanted to be an exceptional performer, people wanted to beat all their competitors, and no excuse for losing, and they wanted to fight at all costs to win a game. And if that's the case, we all know that there's probably not everyone would be the winner. Not everyone will be winning a game or a competition. So in situations when people wanted to win but they lose, or in situations when people feel that they reach to a level that they couldn't realize their kind of inflated self-concepts, they would be more likely to take the banned approach for self-enhancement, which is to dope, because dope allows them to train at a higher rate, allow them to perform more, at a excel more at performance settings. And we all know doping is banned in sports. However, those people would be more likely to risk, which is also linked to narcissistic personality traits as well. Because in general social personality domains, we find individuals high in narcissism tend to take higher risk. They are probably more impulsive, and they are probably more ruthless, and and they probably would be more likely to cheat as well. And in sports, again, so we make the hypothesis they would be more likely to dope. So that's how we conceptualize narcissism and doping. And when looking into grandiose and vulnerable narcissisms, and we would say, so the hypothesis we just established between narcissism and doping is mainly focused on grandiose side of narcissism, and centered into individuals' desperate needs for self-enhancement and personal glory, and I want to realize that. And however, looking into vulnerable narcissisms, our understanding so far is people with vulnerable narcissism trait tend to be more hypersensitive and hyper-vigilant to ego threats. So they could be potentially more aggressive or more hyper-reactive to any threats. When I say threats, like negative feedbacks or situations that makes one feel their positive image could be ruined, and in sports settings might be a losing situation, those so kind of things. So many things, you can name it. And so we build our hypothesis that if individuals, if we predict a positive relationship or association between grandiose narcissism and the doping, we might see an even greater relationship between narcissism and doping if the individual is high in vulnerability. Because that vulnerability could trigger that desperate needs for self-enhancement and making them more willing to winning at all costs, if that makes sense. So we hypothesized that the narcissism doping related issues would be more problematic when vulnerable narcissism is high rather than low.
I think the study kind of pointed out that self-compassion works against it, but it doesn't work against it if they're vulnerable. Is that right? Or I know I'm putting you on the spot with that. I think that if you were the grandiose narcissist, then if you self-compassion work to like mitigate that in terms of doping risk, but if you were the vulnerable, it didn't quite work in that way. And I just wondered, like, do you know any reasons for that, or how come it doesn't work in the same, self-compassion doesn't work in the same way to mitigate it?
At the moment, it's difficult to say, and I don't want to make a conclusive kind of remark on this issue, because we are still carrying out research and trying to find out why, or trying to replicate the findings. I think what we can see from now is generally self-compassion is very powerful against narcissism-related doping risk. And based on the conceptualization, it allows narcissistic individuals to accept more the failures, facing better the failures. And from a hypothesis side of thing, we would think self-compassion should be working with vulnerable side of narcissism, because vulnerable narcissism is more about hypersensitivity, hypervigilant to ego threats, but self-compassion could allow individuals to accept more negative feedbacks, ego threats, so less hypersensitive and less hypervigilant to ego threats, so should be benefiting. When breaking down into vulnerable narcissism, grandiose narcissism, and their interaction with self-compassion, or even fears of compassion, there's some story we feel we're not so sure yet. So I don't really want to comment on that detailed level. However, I believe self-compassion or being less fearful of compassion could help narcissistic people, regardless whether high in grandiose or low in or high in vulnerable narcissism, to better engage in better, more healthier behaviors, not only in sports but also beyond.
And another one of your studies kind of played on self-compassion even more and talked about the psychological distress and barrier to physical activity. I think it was barrier to physical activity.
Yeah, barrier to physical activity.
Yeah.
That's another. What seems to jump from performance sports to physical activity health settings, and yes, that's an interesting one. I quite like it, and so that's why I say my research is probably around narcissism, compassion, self-compassion, self-concepts, and I wanted to see how these self-concepts influence people's behavior in performance settings, health settings. So that's why I'm also looking into physical activity research as well. So in that particular study, so that's a part of our funded studies on looking to, I call it CAMP. So it's a sequential mixed methods investigation of longitudinal impact of compassion in active lifestyle, mental health, wellness, and pro-social behaviors, pro-sociality. So that study is one of the pilot for that larger longitudinal studies. You may see later this year or maybe next some of our findings from our larger project. So the study you mentioned, I believe, is our pilot preliminary studies. Right. And in that studies, we hypothesized that self-compassion can also help individuals to engage in health behaviors, such as physical activities. And the reasons we hypothesize that is, again, sitting very closely to the emotional regulation, mental health, coping benefits of self-compassion, because we believe one of the key barriers to physical activity is, for example, poor mental health, poor mental states such as psychological distress. As we see many people complain about, I couldn't do, I'm too tired, I'm too exhausted, mentally fatigued, I couldn't do exercise. And or we find there are a lot of evidence suggesting people a negative relationship between depression and physical activity, health behaviors, those sort of things. So we hypothesize that if self-compassion help people to feel better, to suffer less from psychological distress, then it should or potentially be able to help people to engage physical activity more because they are feeling better. And one of the mechanisms in between mental health or less psychological distress and higher physical activity is people feel they are more capable to overcome barriers to physical activity. For example, when weather is bad, when the work is too much, when I'm in a bad mood, and when I have child work to do. So there were lots of barriers when the facilities are not so accessible. So we have lots of barriers to physical activities, but we need to have that level of confidence to overcome those barriers to engage in physical activity, if that makes sense. So you see a clear path that we hypothesize that individuals with higher levels of self-compassion would be less likely to suffer from psychological distress, which subsequently increase individuals' self-efficacy or self-confidence to overcome barriers to physical activity, which ultimately leads to higher levels of physical activity. And from our initial study, we kind of find the relationship, the indirect effect, so which is very, very exciting. And I can tell you a little bit more about our longitudinal studies, our phase 1 longitudinal studies. So we checked over 600 UK citizens from all areas, and kind of we had a quite UK national representative sample, and I checked them for 10 months. And our initial findings suggested that self-compassion at time 1 influenced barrier efficacy to, individuals' confidence to overcome barriers to physical activity at time 2, which then leads to greater physical activity at time 3. And we used some typical statistical methods that controlled the different confound throughout the 10 months, 3 time points. So we have quite decent evidence suggesting a causal effect of self-compassion on increasing individuals' confidence to overcome barriers to physical activity and ultimately leading to physical activity. And now we are in a stage of interviewing people, trying to find out people's subjective experience about it. So I guess there will be more work coming out. But I guess a very powerful thing is self-compassion can help people to adapt and or adopt and maintain healthy behaviors such as physical activities. From some of our recent interviews, we find the powerful or the most effective side of self-compassion is to allow individuals to see any failed sessions or failed sessions. For example, when people tend to schedule a session to gym or do some exercise, but there were things happening and which stopped them to do so. So more self-compassionate individuals tend to see these as normal situations and tend to see that they've already done their best, so they feel less guilty and they feel they are in a ready position to make it next time. However, individuals probably lower in self-compassion tends to feel more guilty and they feel really anxious about not making a session they planned to, and which has the sustained effect that they feel they are probably not able to make a next session again when similar things happened. So you see, self-compassion may not be directly linked to individuals' activities. However, it's more about how people see situations, how people react to difficult settings when difficult things coming out, and self-compassion help people to see it more positively and help them to be more prepared and more capable to recuperate, to engage in the future rather than quit and stay guilty.
Wow. So alongside sports psych and individual differences, we've got health psychology in there as well.
Yeah, some health psychology elements in there.
So on that health psychology topic, so you've mentioned stuff like self-efficacy, and when you're on about like barriers to entry and stuff, you're talking about like the theory of planned behavior sort of thing, and like this intention behavior gap, and sort of closing this gap between wanting to do physical activity or carry out these health related behaviors, and there's this gap there, and that self-compassion can sort of close that gap. And I wondered if you'd looked into other things like healthy eating maybe, or like increasing fruit consumption, which is quite common in the literature. It's trying to get children to eat more fruit in their diets and stuff. And I wonder if you'd looked at similar things with self-compassion, because you've mentioned physical activity. So I wondered if it had sort of crossover effects with healthy eating, or like smoking cessation, reducing alcohol consumption, etc.
I believe there will be a positive effect, absolutely. I haven't done anything alongside that, but at the moment we have several projects looking into things like eating disorders, like we're looking into muscle dysmorphia as well, and hoping to look into, well, originally these type of research are developed from narcissism perspective, so narcissistic individuals are probably more prone to muscle dysmorphia, and it's the vulnerable side of narcissism particularly prone to muscle dysmorphia, and which is quite interesting. But then we tried to add in the self-compassion side of the thing, try to mirror or replicate similar findings in the study I mentioned for the narcissism interplay, looking into narcissism self-compassion interplay in doping, and we hypothesized that self-compassion could be linked to lower levels of muscle dysmorphia, and it is particularly beneficial for people high in narcissism. So we started looking into eating disorder, we started looking into muscle dysmorphia, we started looking into some supplement use as well, but I couldn't give you any conclusive remark at the moment, because they are either at planning stage or collecting data, but maybe in the future we could do something around that. But to me, I hold a firm belief self-compassion can be useful. It's just such a powerful tool, although I recognize there were various different conceptualizations. Some people see self-compassion as a trait, some people see it as a mental strategy, but generally, I feel if we see self-compassion at a mindset level, it can be very helpful. especially if we can extend self-compassionate mind into context-specific settings. For example, apply self-compassion to smoking or alcohol cessation. That could be very powerful. But I guess the key to that is we need to realize, or we need to make it clear or find it out what self-compassion means in that smoking or binge drinking context. And that's why at the moment we started looking into context-specific self-compassion, and we started to work around that work in sports, but then we started to extend that into bodybuilding, eating disorder, muscle dysmorphia as well. Yeah.
It's so exciting. It's also infant stage, isn't it? That's why we love psychology, and there's so
exactly.
much.
That was bringing in clinical there as well.
Yeah.
We had
Yeah.
eating disorders.
Yeah,
so.
it has some clinical kind of implications, but what we really wanted to do is not so in clinical. We want to tackle a clinical issue probably from a preventive perspective rather than from a treatment perspective. Because if we believe from a psychological point of view, if we believe all of us has the same list of ingredients, but just more or less, then the thing is we wanted to find out a way to make our ingredients more healthier or more healthier ways to use our ingredients. So potentially everyone in whatever settings could develop a problem, just more or less. However, we wanted to take a psychological perspective to train people, to educate people, to take a more healthy approach to themselves, and to realize themselves in their specific settings, regardless it's sports, it's academic, or even military performance settings, or just exercise bodybuilding.
There's so much application, isn't there?
Yeah.
How do you see it kind of being delivered? You mentioned it's like a preventative thing, but like, how do you go about delivering a preventative CFT therapy for athletes?
Wow, that's a difficult question to me.
Yeah.
I have to say, because I don't have much practitioner experiences. I did do some like consultation jobs with some of the clubs, teams, but in person, I'm not so rich in counseling experience in particular in a therapy settings. However, my feeling is, a counseling approach has its advantages. We can work on more individualized needs. But I see the potential issue with a counseling approach. It's not necessarily an issue, but a limitation. Anything has a limitation. What I wanted to do is probably to promote self-compassion or compassion-based education to a more population level, to a more cost-effective level. So people can use it easily without having access to a professional's guidance to do it. So with that said, I would be definitely considering potential podcasting or kind of interventions like this. That's why I'm here. And I would also consider some of the classic health behavior epidemiologist approach of interventions, such as things like we could potentially work with some artists to build some really interesting codes about self-compassion words and make it everyone's like what is called the screenshots on your mobile phone, something every day, like a prompt to remind people to be self-compassionate, things like that. There were different ways to do so. And however, at the moment, I think we need to understand more about compassion, how compassion influences individuals' behaviors, and in each context, we need to understand that theories and framework more before we really started to look into intervention. Because I guess I'm probably going back to the study we just discussed, the self-compassion influencing benefiting physical activities. If we develop some self-compassion intervention or whatever thing, and we find people increase the physical activities, it could be exciting, because we find a compassion intervention in help individuals do exercise. However, if we only look into self-compassion or compassion practice and the behavior side of things, we don't know what is actually happening, because that intervention can be useful for someone but not so useful for the others, and we never know what's the exactly psychological processes or things happening in between. And that's why we wanted to do some more theoretical type of studies and making like serious hypotheses and reasonings, looking into what might be the potential psychological processes underpinning a self-compassion practices into certain domains. So, for example, I'm going back to the physical activity studies again. We propose self-compassion help people to be more capable to overcome barriers, and if we find this evidence could be potentially built into a program. So if we're going to develop self-compassion intervention next time, we could be focusing on developing self-compassion as a tool to help people to overcome barriers, rather than cultivating self-compassion as a general mindset. Yeah. And then people find it's probably so difficult to use or to apply to physical activity settings, if that makes sense. So that's why I say we want to do more theoretical research to uncover the actual psychological process underpinning the effectiveness of compassion or any self-concepts or psychological skills first. So when we design those skill training or typical intervention, we know what we're going to tackle. It's kind of like if we're going to go a medical treatment, we know we're actually targeting at whatever cells or biological processes to cure the thing. So we have things to target rather than just giving you the treatment.
Yeah. And then you don't actually know what you've achieved if you give it and
have
a positive effect, and you can't actually, what's it actually doing?
Yeah, so we wanted to know what's actually happening. Yeah. And the benefit of this approach is also allow us to realize or to explore potential individual differences. So there might be a typical way people benefit the same program differently. For example, for some people, overcoming barriers is so important, but for some people, gaining psychological well-being is more important. And so in terms of performing, for example, I'm taking physical activity as again in order to engage in physical activity. So compassion could fulfill different things, but for different persons or different people. So if without knowledge into the actual psychological process, what's happening in between the intervention or the program and the behavioral outcomes, we cannot tailor anything. We cannot help individuals to develop their own strategies. So that's why we are so keen to uncover the psychological processes underpinning for example, compassion or any strategies, practical things, and any of our interested behavioral outcomes.
Yeah. I think your point about making it specific for behavioural change is a really good one. I think when I look back at like my example at the start, when we first started this conversation of when I wanted to get involved with sports psychology, but at a lower level, people aren't involved with the like mental skills training and like the psychology of it. A lot of general population find wishy-washy, probably because it hasn't got to that behavioural activation stage yet of CFT and mind training, that kind of thing. So adapting it so you can actually achieve that behavioural change will be a big significant jump in getting athletes to be involved with it if you're going to target a general population. But that's what it's doing clinically, because people, when you do a CFT treatment on a clinical population, they have the like invested interest of they want to increase their depression or reduce their depression or anxiety, that kind of thing. But there was an app, I think it was Swedish app that delivered it to a general population that were just below a threshold for being diagnosed with depression or anxiety, so a preventative intervention. And it was super effective. So statistically, the control group, it was around 60% of them within 3 months met the threshold for depression or anxiety, and it was 80% of the people that took the intervention didn't. I can't work out the maths on the top of my head, but I mean that's a huge percentage of people that would have been prevented from getting depression, anxiety, and quite a lot of that proportion also had like an almost comorbidity with body dysmorphia as well. So it might link quite well with your muscle dysmorphia. So I mean, if you're looking at it clinically, could be huge links into how it will work within athletes, specifically within behavioural activation, as soon as you can get that kind of link in to do it. But it is super interesting. I mean, hearing you talk about it is, I can't wait to see how you're going to actually deliver that intervention practically. It'll be really interesting to.
Thank you so much, and I would be really appreciative and looking forward to see how we are going to develop that interventions. But I guess we are started to getting some knowledges. For example, how we may be potentially delivering anti-doping interventions from a compassion kind of approach. And I guess you mentioned a really interesting story that we want to, for example, prevent depression, prevent anxiety, and or any clinical maladaptive outcomes, or maybe in subclinical settings there were some typical behaviors or typical things we want to avoid. And when we started to look into those things, or when we started to design interventions, and we always want to tackle those end issues. So we want to tackle depression when developing an intervention. It is entirely possible for people to not tackling the end outcomes, but deliver a very useful interventions. I think that would be the approach I would be looking forward to do. It helps us to make better science, help us to avoid like a bias or social desirabilities. And more interestingly, when we look into more controversy issues such as doping or drug control, those sort of things, and we can potentially develop something not mentioning drugs or dopings at all. It could be something related to coping, because if we have dedicated evidence that coping, being unable to cope with adversity, is the reason why people started to use drugs in sports or whatever other recreational drugs or in social settings. If we find that's the mechanisms, we don't have to educate people to drug is bad. All people know drug is bad. When people bought a cigarette, they know there were like terrible photos, pictures. They know the health consequence, but they still choose to engage in it. With that said, I said that many of these behavioral consequences or outcomes we want to avoid is actually when people engage them, they are actually intentional. It's not inadvertent. They are so intentional. So if it is intentional, we need to find out why they are so willing to do it, even they know it is bad, and so we can potentially work on the mechanisms is so important. So for example, we can potentially work on like depressive or marginal depressive populations, developing something to prevent it, but working on teaching people a more positive or healthier appraisal approach. So we are not going to do any CBT or whatever CFT on depression-focused issues. We are basically telling people to be more appreciative to their life. So it's not about depression, it's about appreciation. It's about happiness. If we believe that I'm not saying it's not science. We're just I'm just trying to use these as a very lay examples. So if we want to work on mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, we don't have to work on it directly. We can work on something else. Work on the mechanisms, the real underpinning problems. The underpinning problems might be appraisal. The underpinning problems might be could be maladaptive perfectionism, could be something else. And that's why I say theoretical research in psychology is so important, because it helps us to understand what's exactly mattered in these problems. If we can identify that, we can work on the process rather than the outcomes, because only when there is a right process, underpinning process, we can have the right outcomes. So I guess that could be the next wave of whatever psychological practices, or what we could call it preventive practice. But again, we have a long way to go.
Yeah, a lot more research to do. It's exciting.
Yeah, that's why I'm so keen in research. And so I guess I mentioned the theoretical research again. I'm not saying I'm not interested in intervention. I'm very interested in intervention, but I haven't done a lot of interventions just because I don't want to jump into intervention without a proper understanding about the process.
Because as you said, foundation, don't you? You want it to be a backbone of it first. Yeah.
Yeah. And effective interventions looks good, but as you said, there might be a significant proportion in whatever intervention group which actually didn't change.
Yeah.
And why is that? And what people seldom already investigated it. And in order to understand that, that's why I say we'd better started with theoretical research, understanding the psychological underpinnings.
Yeah. Well, I guess within the clinical world, we kind of, well, I actually don't know, but it appears to be we rushed into developing therapies and it hit a threshold of 40% effective, and they're like, okay, yeah, we'll roll it out, it's good enough, and there isn't too much care in what is that 60%, that 40% of people that aren't effective, too, that because that foundation maybe hasn't been laid as well as it has been. And I mean, we think about all the time, we look at the amount of research that comes out in all these new therapies, and it's not that much really. So to lay all these things down properly is going to allow, when it does come to the intervention, to just ploughed out and they're all solid and great and really effective. I think it's 100% the right way to go about it. It's definitely, the work is needed.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I agree. And I'm not a clinical person. I realize I probably shouldn't have talked too much about a clinical thing. And I think clinical research has its own value. Clinical practice has its own value, because we need treatment. Mm-hmm. However, from our perspective, I think we have been focused so much on clinical side of thing, and how about let's focus more on preventive side of thing. And if we want to prevent it, we can't really work on the outcomes, because how are you going to cure somebody who's still not displaying any clinical symptoms, but you want them to improve that outcomes? It's nonsense, or not so feasible to do that, because they are not displaying anything from a clinical point of view. You're healthy, you're absolutely fantastic. However, the process might be wrong, which could potentially contribute into a potential clinical issues in a few years' time, or whatever, in a certain point in the future. And from a preventive side of perspective, we wanted to understand the process, because we want to make the process right, so we can make our end outcomes right.
Yeah, so you're able to screen loads of narcissistic people, or screen loads of players, deliver a self-compassion coping strategy and disguise it as that, and then no doping. Amazing.
Yeah. We don't have to screen. We don't have to screen narcissism, but I guess, because if we believe people would have more or less, or people could develop some narcissistic traits or whatever potential issues, and I guess the thing is, if we find this is the way, self-compassion, or being able to see difficulty, failures, and the sufferings in a more healthy way, helps people to cope. We can help people to train this, and then it could potentially help with anti-doping. It could potentially lead to better performance. So we are actually working on the process.
Amazing. Yeah. Have you got anything else you want to add?
I wondered if you wanted to ask about that at all.
Oh yes,
before we wrap up.
Definitely. Yeah, I've got two quick. We'll talk about. Can I dig a little bit deeper into the True Athlete project?
The True Athletes Project.
Yeah. So what kind of is it, and what's your involvement within it, if you're allowed to talk about that?
Oh, okay, yeah, that's interesting. So I've recently started to having some collaboration with them, and I don't think I should talk too much about it.
Okay.
So basically, I'm not so deeply engaged in it, but we started to do, so the True Athletes Project is looking to taking a real compassionate approach, potentially. Basically for enhancing sports performance and mental health as well. So, and we started to have some more collaborations, trying to transform research into practices, but also using practice to inform our research. We started to develop some of these things, and that's the thing I can tell here. But if you want to understand more about the True Athletes Project, I think we can potentially make another. You can potentially reach out to the right persons, or I can help you to direct to the right person for making another sessions. So I think that is absolutely fine. But I feel resistant to talk too much about
that's
that.
Fine,
yeah, because that's not my project. But we've started to reach out, building these compassion-related community in sports settings, and the True Athletes Project is certainly one of its leading in it. It's transforming research into practices, and it's building its influences and impacts.
Yeah, my other kind of question was completely unrelated to pretty much everything that we talked about, but I think it's a great one. I was kind of wondering, do you get involved with any sports or anything? Do you play anything like that? No?
Well, I used to.
Right.
I used to. I'm never in any high levels,
Right.
but I like swimming.
Okay.
And when I was small, especially open water swimming, and I used to be doing some. Well, when I was at school time, I used to do some really weird thing like discus throwing and things like that.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, and those type of thing. And you used to be running 100-meter, 200 meters, those kind of things. I'm a sprinter. Yeah, sprinter. That's the right word. And I like the basketball, but I think about 12, 13 years ago, I broken my ankle, and so I started to quit. And at the moment, I'm only doing really leisure exercise or sports. Like my top sport is probably hiking in the weekends. Walk around the Peak Districts, and that's my kind of mid-age sports.
Well, it's lovely. We've got so many walks around there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Well, it's been an absolutely amazing chat, Shug. Thank you so much for
no problem.
talking to us.
Yes, it's my pleasure to come here as well.
It's been fantastic. Yeah,
Lovely.
I'm really happy
Perfect.
with it. Oh,
thank you.